everybody, to the May 19th, 2021 meeting of SMPTE New York. We are delighted to have a really interesting group of people that know an intense amount about production metadata, workflows and standards for media and entertainment. We will be introducing everybody shortly. Just to give you a little bit of information about our organization and our meeting. These are our sponsors. Thank you very much. We appreciate your sponsorship. In all cases, we will put that money to good use in terms of improving our ability to host meetings and communicate with our members and recruit new members. So thank you very much for your sponsorship. If you'd like to see your logo up on that screen, the person to contact is Carl Cavagnolo, and his phone number is shown on the screen. And we'd be more than happy to add you to the very distinguished list of people who are sponsors of SMPTE New York. If you're not a SMPTE member, we would love to have you join in. There are multiple different classifications of membership with different rights and privileges. And, please support us by joining. Sponsors are good, members are even better. And we love having as many people in the New York or even wider area as possible become part of our local section. The meeting tonight, and I want to put out a big thank you to Joe LaGrasso, who has definitely put together a very interesting group of people and has taken care of a lot of the details that go into making a meeting. If you'd like to make a meeting yourself, we're always open for great ideas, and we'll help you through the process. And I'm here to help support some of the technology, the Zoom windows, the webinars, all that other good stuff. And finally, the reason why you came to this meeting is to hear our great speakers. So I'm going to pass this over to Joe and have him give you a little rundown of and to introduce our first speaker and keep things moving along. So thank you very much. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you, everyone, for joining this evening. And it's going to be a very interesting topic. And we're going to start first with Yonah Levenson, Manager of Metadata Strategy and Taxonomy Governance with WarnerMedia. And then Will Kreth will follow and join us. Will is a metadata consultant and part of the DDEX working group co-chair. So before I get into, no, I'm going to introduce Yonah first, if that's okay. Yonah never anticipated that when she answered an ad in college to typeset for as a student, but with the newspaper, that it would launch her career in metadata, standards, and markup. She has been instrumental in implementing change wherever she works at WarnerMedia, and she is the manager of metadata strategy and taxonomy governance and leads the effort to extend the terminology and consistency for the enterprise while adhering to industry standards. She received her master's in library and information science from Rutgers University. Yonah is the chair of Language Metadata Table Committee, which is sponsored by MESA and SMPTE. The LMT, a vetted list of language codes that comply with the IETF BCP 47, is becoming accepted as the master source of language codes for the media and entertainment industry, and has been adopted by the standards organizations and content creators just as a startup. She is the co-director, co-founder as an instructor, as well as an instructor for Rutgers online digital asset management certification program, which launched in September 2019. She was recently honored as Rutgers Professional Development Instructor of the Year for 2020 through 2021. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you for your time and sharing with us, Yonah. And Thank you and congratulations on your award this past year.
Thank you very much. This is all about, this is an overview of metadata. And thank you for that introduction, Joe. And this is about enough background to help you get started. So let's see where it takes us. And as I was introduced, I work on the metadata strategy and taxonomy governance at WarnerMedia. I'm the co-founder and co-chair of the language metadata table, and I'll be presenting on that a little bit later. And then the Rutgers Professional Development Instructor of the Year, the Digital Asset Management Program, and I'll be glad to talk about that a little bit more as well. WarnerMedia, I certainly hope at least, let's put it this way, as of Friday, this was certainly an accurate slide. And let's see where life takes everybody. So here we go. This is the agenda. You guys can read. I'm not going to read it to you. So I'm just going to dive in. What I wanted to talk about today is that there's basically these 7 different kinds of metadata. And what are they? And here they are. There's descriptive, technical, administrative, usage, structural, archive preservation, and rights. And the reason why I'm bringing these up is so this way then you can be thinking about how you use metadata in your day in, day out job. And you might be wanting to think about what is the different kind of metadata you're actually either looking at or possibly populating in a system. And also to think a little bit about who the audience is for that metadata. And if you're receiving it, where did it come from? And then where is it going to? Because what I keep finding in my world, both at, professionally, at my organization, as well as when I am teaching at Rutgers, that people think about like kind of what they have to do and only what they have to do, and not necessarily how far the metadata goes and who needs it and for what. So when you start thinking about, oh, I got to fill in another metadata field, what do they want from me? There's probably a reason behind it. So I'm going to take a little bit of time today and show you or share with you information about the different kinds of metadata. So descriptive metadata, as it says, it's going to describe, identify the asset itself, and it's often used for searching and retrieving, and it's and therefore discovery. And sometimes people say, well, it's the aboutness. What do I need to know about this asset or this title or this thing? So some examples of descriptive metadata. Some people, and also one of our panelists is fortunate to have James Snyder from the Library of Congress, and he may have some other comments on some of these fields. But right now, I stick the identifier under the descriptive metadata. We want to know who created it, who was the author, who was the artist, who was the photographer, who wrote this script, who's starring in this script, or who's an extra, etc. What that title is, or the name of the show, of the series, of the book that something was based on, etc. We may want to know where something was shot, and we may want to know even what time of day was that shoot, depending on what's going on. So that's an example of some descriptive metadata. Technical metadata is usually the more information about the digital asset, such as the file size, the type of file. There may, in this world, from the SMPTE perspective, the compression scheme, that we may want to know the software application that is used, and there's just a whole host. They want to, is it HDR? Is it, IMF, or, all these different kinds of technical standards that are needed in order to help that content get displayed in some way, shape, or form, whether it's streaming or, put on a DVD, etc. Administrative metadata is often about the lineage or the provenance of an asset. So they may want to know who created the asset, who touched it last, when was it created, when was it modified, where can I find it? Because like, where is it actually stored? Is it maybe from an archive perspective, you know, which, if it's on, oh, now I'm spacing out on what they're called, but if it's on a tape, what shelf is it on? What building is it in? Is it at Iron Mountain? Which location? Or you may just want to know the path of where a particular something is. And even also, I've done some work in this space for the original camera files. What type of camera was used? What was the software level? All those additional, well, the software itself may end up falling under the technical, but the administrative also could be, you know, what kind of camera was used. So some of these can kind of go back and forth, the different metadata fields, but where I'm really trying to get you to go is to think about what the metadata is that's being captured, and then who may need it for what purpose. Usage would be the provenance of the asset. So perhaps where was that asset used? How many times was it used? Was it modified? Is it used as is? There's a metadata standard called Dublin Core, where there's a term called relation. So this is kind of trying to establish, in some cases, the hierarchy of, is this fall under something, or is it equal to something else? So is it a particular version? So is it part of something? Does it contain multiple parts? Was it ever referenced? So again, we want to know about the usage. I previously came from the publishing world, educational publishing, and they often wanted to know if a photograph was used, you know, how many times was the particular photograph used, because they don't want to look like they're lazy and using the same photo over and over again. So I would think, for example, in the news space, that you don't want to keep using the same photo of a particular person over and over again, unless it's like totally iconic, perhaps, you know, Albert Einstein, plus he is no longer with us. Whereas you may want to make sure if you've got somebody, you know, famous or whatever that the story is on, you want to have something that's particularly current. So therefore, going back here, whoops, that with the administrative, how old is that asset? Or actually I did some work, newspaper work, and they wanted to know what was the date of the Manhattan skyline, because again, it can differ depending on the weather or particular time frame from when the image was shot. Structural information is about an asset, and also again, the relationship between its parts. And often, particularly in the archival world, they may want to know what's the order that something has to be, you know, that was used for creation, just in case they may need to recreate it at some point. We certainly know that there's a lot of touching up or recoloring or colorization and all different kinds of things where existing content is being remastered. So they want to make sure that they put it, if they farm it all out, they want to make sure they're pulling it together in the right way so that it's in order. So again, from my book world, page numbers, sections, chapters, tables of contents, but for us in the media and entertainment space, scene numbers, or again, what's the sequence of these particular, you know, clips or sets of files, you know, what's the order they need to go in? And we need to know, you know, here's my opener, here's all my stuff in the middle, it goes in this order, and then here's my closing credits, for example, and then the markers that go with it. Preservation and archival. I list in here that it's needed to find and discover assets and content, but as I said, it often can be more, again, for the reconstruction. So all of these different standards can end up tying back together in order to recreate something. So I have from a preservation archival, again, where is something stored? They may also want to have some digital information. Is this digital or not? Is it physical or not? If they take something physical and digitize it, and then they have to transfer it someplace else, how do I know that when I sent it over for X, that it really got the whole file? So they may need to know how large it is and then check and make sure it's okay. And also from a preservation archival perspective, there is most likely a retention policy. How long should I keep this? So for our content, we probably want to keep it, you know, as long as we possibly can. And, you know, that could be forever. Whereas the retention policy for certain kinds of contracts, those or agreements, those may expire after a certain amount of time. So that can go in, that could be part of retention policy. However, there's also rights information, anything that might be pertaining to intellectual property and usage rights. So that can get into your licensing and permissions, and anything legal can get into your contracts, and who cleared it, who approved it, who said, no, you can't use this ever again, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the 7 different kinds of metadata. Let's talk for just a moment about standards. And I love this quote by Andrew S. Tannenbaum. And the nice thing about standards is you have so many to choose from. And here SMPTE is a standards organization. And then the question is, why do you need a metadata standard? So you have to think about, when you're trying to decide which standard you're going to use, you need to figure out, you know, why are you using a standard in this first place? Are you in a completely closed environment, or are you ever going to have to share? In this day and age, I expect everybody to have some kind of a digital storage something. So therefore, there's probably existing metadata terms. Also, if people are standing up new systems or updating existing ones, how much time is needed till you have to get this thing up and running? And therefore, how much time do you have to really check your metadata and make sure that whatever you're using in-house is the right standard? You also want to keep in mind, is there a need to share the metadata with other areas? So again, that's where SMPTE ends up being really important because of all of its standards. Methodology, just to get started, what I certainly would recommend that folks do is you could start with a spreadsheet and just enter in whatever you have. And because it's very helpful when you start to see metadata in different columns, and then you have the different systems across, and I'll show you, right. So in here's a terms inventory. So here is, here's just actually a couple of samples. So a title, it's the title of the content or the asset, how many times you could use it. Is it a free text field, or is it a pull down list? So the player, the actors, whatever, the person's first name, that would probably be a free text field, but the role they play, maybe that's a controlled vocabulary, because that could be an actor, it could be the best boy, it could be the producer, it could be the director. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. So again, going back to tools and spreadsheets, you can add as many tabs as you need. So again, if you may want to break stuff out into the different kinds of metadata, descriptive, technical, administrative, usage, etc., you can have a tab for each, and then help to use that when you're trying to figure out what you actually need. The nice thing about spreadsheets is that there's free software out there, and easily accessible, like Google, and people get used to looking at those workbooks. The other thing that I'm a proponent of are taxonomy tools. So this way that you can actually do a lot more within a specific tool, where you can capture information about the different taxonomies, that I have title in system A and TTL in system B, and maybe they call it the, name of the thing in system E, etc. And you can make sure that those are all related to each other. And the way you know that is when you do your terms inventory in a cross map, then you can see in those columns what everything is, and then figure out which is your preferred term and take it from there. So one of the other things that's really important with taxonomy is make sure that there's some kind of a governance process to make sure that you have people from across your organization involved, and you show them and work with them and partner with them to make sure everybody's comfortable with the terms that end up getting selected, and then make sure that you get approval with them. And if you end up using like title, everybody agrees to use title instead of TTL or name of the thing, you can end up having a lot of time savings, and you have better consistency and better reporting and everything else from there. And when you get the approvals, you document that these were approved. So somebody else comes in, let's just say your company gets purchased by another company, then you can say, hey, look, we have all these subject matter experts and they have already approved these terms. When you write everything down, it helps establish the provenance, it helps you build your case, and again, document it in your spreadsheet or taxonomy tool if you have one. I also, in every workbook that I create, I always have an overview tab that explains the purpose of that workbook, because then you know who's involved with it, who created it, when they created it, when they last edited it. And again, I always put in the definition of the, a purpose for that workbook. One of the things to keep in mind is who are the key contributors for governance, and who contributes and who do you partner with. So you need, so here's just some examples of the kind of folks I tend to work with: the production, I work with analytics, there's subject matter experts, both in the business and the technical side, and then there's other resources as well. You also want to make sure you have some governors who are really the sponsors of the whole project in the first place. If you have questions, you can find me here, and also I'll make the slide deck available afterwards, and there's some additional information, so just not going to really go into it, but you can see here, like, here's a couple of different organizations, and therefore what kinds of standards, just representative standards that they may have at their organization. So that's life in a nutshell. Went a little bit long, but I hope it was informative.
Well, thank you, Yonah. So basically, you just set the table for us newbies and us beginners in this subject area. Yonah will be back to us shortly to update us on the LMT, the language metadata table, and where that's going and what it's all about. So we'll come back to you in a little bit. And I think we're going to introduce now Will Kreth, who's the metadata consultant for the DDEX working group, co-chair. Will, why don't you say hello to everybody?
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Joe. I'm mainly consulting these days for a company out of London called Metadata Systems that has business in the United States. And I'll take you through my presentation today. That's just 9 slides plus a title slide, and we'll get into it.
Excellent. Let me read your bio for you. Will Kreth is an advisor to Metadata Systems, a leading SaaS provider of film and television metadata workflow and automation tools, and to Simply.tv, a Copenhagen-based TV metadata EPG, electronic program guide, and metadata services provider to the Nordics and worldwide. Will has 2 U.S. patents on interactive video. He's the former executive director of EIDR.org, which is Entertainment ID Registry.org, and he is the director of metadata at Showtime Network. So thank you so much for joining us, and take us through.
The former director of metadata at Showtime. Past tense, it's all good. That was,
doesn't say former here.
oh, what the was, the key on the W, the was part, yes. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm looking forward to walking you through these 9 slides here and our old magic title slide here. Metadata Systems been around for a few years, working with some of the clients you may know of and see names here that you recognize. And pretty well so far, but a sales pitch conversation, much as a setup of where the supply chain is at today, and also some of the pain points that people are feeling out there with regards to a host of issues that we'll talk about here in just a second. So basically, fundamentally, there's a concept of a flow of a title through a supply chain. You've got rights management software, you've got catalog management software, asset management, localization, content scheduling, your scheduling systems, especially those of you in broadcast and now who are adapting to ad-supported VOD or subscription VOD platforms of OTT. The packaging and preparation of the content that is so necessary before it hits the customer, and the delivery and the protection of the content. You may also, in that, this kind of the boxcars across the tree and across the slide, have a variety of licensors and distributors you work with, localization studios for subs and dubs, certification bodies like SMPTE, public domain sources and content producers. And you may also enrich and enhance the content with third-party sources like Metacritic or Common Sense Media, Rotten Tomatoes, also metadata from the big guys, the giants of the industry like Gracenote and TiVo. You may also want to, in that the supply chain, think about from the packaging and delivery protection side of the D2C platforms, the VOD platforms, and also all the operators you work with on the linear side. And then you may also have rating by all the analytics, looking at the data, the viewer usage, the KPIs and metrics come back, all flow back into catalog management. And then you have a lot of people who are traditionally today still running these systems and running them well, hopefully being able to make the best use of their time, but there is also a lot of overhead in this process, as you can tell. We have a host of different things that can affect the supply chain, including point solutions around integrations, custom legacy applications, lack of documentation. Sometimes Yonah knows this very well. She mentioned, like, if a subject matter expert leaves the company or someone buys your company or a company gets sold, you may not, the person who knew how that system ran may no longer be there. You have applications often that are not running with modern APIs. The data structures may be inconsistent. The application may run on-premise and not in the cloud, and that may be a limiting factor. You may have an application that is so gigantic that it's hard to get a change request through with the vendor you worked with because it's a bit of a monolith. And then, like I said, the departed knowledge experts. So anyway, the long and the short of it is the complex supply chains give rise to common challenges in metadata. And some of those pain points briefly described here, and you heard this earlier with Yonah, and that was a lack of governance. Really, teams may be distributed domestically, internationally, and no one's really in charge of the total story. I see some companies are moving toward councils, metadata councils of governed data councils. The quality of the metadata may be inferior. The newer titles are often in the best shape, but the catalog titles, the longer tail, the older archival content may not be in great shape. We talked about decentralized management coming from multiple sources, seeing duplicate attributes, right? As you've got copies of data and you need to duplicate it, you want to make sure you know the best path forward, because it can be frustrating because you may not know a source of truth. And then you may also basically have a manual process that you want to make automated, and you're ultimately left with wondering, how is this going to work out going forward for scaling, and looking at all the things that the negative outcomes bring, whether they be the risk, like a ticking time bomb of catalog information, the lost revenue you're not seeing from the incomplete or the missing metadata, the subscriber churn from poor descriptions, the poor user experience, and failing in your objectives. So those impacts, those consequences are real, and they're feeling it, and people are talking more and more about how do we improve our internal processes and our coordination of efforts, and we try to change the story. Because it affects things like churn. You know, people can leave because of poor personalization, the constant turnover. We see even the big, even Netflix, even some of the larger OTT providers are seeing people leaving those platforms. You can also have customers who just don't know where to go because the navigation is kind of broken because the metadata is not in great shape through bad descriptions or not enough easy. This is not easy enough to use. James Snyder, we talk about catalog with the British spelling here. Things are harder to license. If you've got unlicensable content because you don't know the rights metadata, you don't know the provenance metadata, you don't know all of the information that would make it licensable, it becomes a struggle. The archives may be inaccessible. You may not be able to, for search and discovery, you may not be able to find what you're looking for, both internally and externally. You ultimately stand to lose revenue from the value of your archives when they're not well described, and there's not a trail from the copyright perspective. So back to the notion that the supply chain could use some improvement. Where are the waste or just the time spent, the inefficiencies, the efficacy of the work that everyone's doing, putting their shoulder to the wheel to make the best possible experience and monetize it more efficiently. So with bad title metadata across the supply chain, these are some of the outcomes that people are seeing. But what you'd really like to have is a categorical source of truth where you can centralize the management. You could have a system of record that's easily accessible, provides a great user experience, and remains agile and flexible with superior enrichment of that content from sources that are known and have APIs that are flexible, these from third parties, so that your supply chain systems are working in harmony, and you can also avail yourself of machine learning and AI to enhance the records for users. Your internal users should have the tools necessary and available to them. That that's dynamically accessible, that the reporting tools are robust and can provide flexibility, right? You may want to segment the content from prioritization standpoint, saying, you know what, I need subtitles and dubs on some content, but I don't know what content. And you need a tool that can say, here's everything in the library that needs to be subtitled for a region or a market. You want to have strong security. You want to have the automation that speeds things through the supply chain and with an API first sensibility. So an ideal solution, as we talked about, would have superior title catalog management, well, forward-thinking metadata enrichment, a supply chain dashboard that was measuring the things that the internal teams know are going to be the drivers for success. You want to work on process automation across the enterprise so that everyone is saying, you know what, we started to work out some of the deep old manual processes, moving more toward an automated system. You want to have those reporting tools that are going to give people what they're looking for as related to the work organization, the work backlog. You want to be able to share that content with others in a way that's elegant and can basically have it be a tool that both internal and external customers can use. And you also want to have a way to localize the content with draft translations and use machine learning for initial translations, and then ultimately have a human editor who has a subject matter expert in local language and culture take that draft translation and finalize it for edition. So today, I'm here at my last slide. We've talked about metadata enrichment. We've talked about the supply chain dashboard side of things in an ideal world, and a advanced superior title catalog management solution that exists out there. But you know, it's deeper than that. The tip of the iceberg starts there. What I'd like to say after this call, and also take your questions after my session, is that there's a lot more to it, as you can see. Ways to automate the enrichment, enhancement of the content. Ways to work on API orchestration and have those advanced reporting tools that are so essential, especially when you start to slice and dice the analysis of both the usage and the success of the content. And also where you need to pay more attention and to prioritize the work. On localization side, having ways to quickly get to a way where you can have draft translations in a stage state so that they can be reviewed by human editors, and then ways to share that content and review it both internally and externally with partners. I'm not going to go into a whole product demo here because that's not the purpose of today, but suffice to say, there are ways to improve some existing heritage or legacy processes out there. And there's a generation of new tools from companies like Meta and others that can do those kind of things. So with that, I'm going to dive out of this and stop my share and say to you, Joe, that willing to take any questions or to transition to how you and Wes would like to move next.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Will. That was really good. Thank you. Wes,
so I have a question.
Go ahead.
So Will, one of the organizations that's had a major impact on things like file formats and compression standards and things like that has been, over the past few years, has been Netflix. They have a very extensive list of technical details that you need to meet in order to submit content to them. How much of an impact are they having or have they had on metadata and the information that has to go with the content?
I would say this is not being a part of their vendor, their supplier program. They've been, Netflix has for a few years had a very robust kind of like vendor management program where like a localization company in South America, and let's say in Brazil, might be a Netflix partner to do a Brazilian Portuguese translation of Netflix content. And they're adhering to, in this instance, and of course they're not the only company doing this, the kind of the Netflix playbook for localization, right? That hosted program, I think, has been a success for them. And I've talked to people like Kreth, who run the global localization, the entertainment globalization nonprofit, and it's to your point. I think it is companies that have stood up and said, look, we need to wrangle a lot of different suppliers and a lot of different needs around subs and dubs and also edits around, like, you can't show a film in Qatar that you might show in Germany, right?
Right.
Because of the cultural edits, and also just some sensitivities. Companies like Global Eagle, who Meta's worked with, have in-flight entertainment for many of the major airlines. And some of them have different edit cuts for different languages and different airlines in particular, saying that, you know, these are the kind of films we need to show. We have to do a tailored, custom version of these films for this airline or this territory, this region.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the having that flexibility and working with third parties in a way that's orchestrated and everyone knows what the playbook is invaluable.
Yonah, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, to Will's point, and metadata in general, is that if you've got a good amount of rich metadata, then you can actually end up creating in your own way. You can create filters for what's needed. What does Netflix need? What does a theatrical distribution need? They're all going to have a title. They're all going to have some kind of synopsis. They're all going to have some kind of cast of characters. Or if you look at other organizations out there that deliver metadata, you know, I don't know what the protocol here is for with all the different names.
That's okay.
But like in IMDb or in India, there's Cube Cinema, and there's all different kinds of distributors of metadata from that perspective. And then there's also what is needed from a delivery standpoint, which is, I think, where SMPTE plays a huge role. So anything that can become consistent, and that actually will end up leading nicely when we're ready into the language metadata table as a standard for lots and lots of folks to implement, it allows you then to mix and match what you need. And one of the things I didn't say is that it's good for metadata if you have one piece of metadata per field, because then you can mix and match as you need. If you need something unique for Netflix, they have their own requirement. You know, then you can just add that and have it available or transform it on the fly.
Great, thank you. All right, I see a couple of things in the Q&A. Joe, Josh Gordon had a question. What is the status on automation with metadata? From the first presentation, it looks like a lot of data needs to be carried for each piece of content. How much of the 7 different kinds of metadata can be readily automated, which not?
The answer is yes. So,
but not easily.
Right, James.
Right, absolutely. So it really depends. Someplace along the line, somebody probably has to key it in. And the question is at whether, you know, from a studio perspective, from my experience, and I've had conversations with others recently, I really think a lot of this stuff needs to happen at time. Once money starts being applied to a project, whatever it is, that's a great time to start creating metadata. Because if you're spending money on it, you should have an idea whether you're making, you know, a movie, or if you're making a documentary, or if you're making, you know, a pilot for a series, or if this is live, you know, newscast television. So if you start there, you probably know who some of the players are that are involved. It should be assigned some kind of identifier. And then as it goes further along, then you may have your descriptions, and then you might be able to mine that and generate genres, generate keywords, etc.
Yeah, I'm going to raise my hand and say there's in one of my Showtime years, there was a saying like the metadata begins when the deal memo, to your point about when it reaches finance, hits someone's desk. Okay, we're acquiring content from a third party, or we're originating content, original series. Well, there's still a business affairs team that's got a deal memo in place, and that's the starting gun for the metadata accrual and enrichment and its origin story.
Cool. All right.
Great.
Joe, do we want to?
Yes, we'll segue. It's a good segue, actually.
Yeah.
Back to Yonah. Yonah, as the chair of the Language Metadata Table Committee, can you tell us a little bit about exactly what it is and where it's headed?
All right, so I am the co-chair of the Language Metadata Table. Meg Morrissey is the other co-chair. She is formerly with Disney and is now consulting to Netflix. So what is it? So the Language Metadata Table, say that fast 10 times, started back in 2017. It started with 128 languages, and it is built on IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, best current practice, number 47. So I was in a meeting and somebody was asking about what language code should we use for Latin American Spanish. And then as you know, being in charge of the metadata services and management, I found out there was SPA-LA, LATAM SPAN, LAS, SPA, all on its own. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. So we started looking around and we found out that there is this IETF BCP 47 standard, and put together something that I thought would take 3-4 months with my team. It ended up taking 16 months to put together all the languages that we had, and that was the initial 128 languages for HBO. I presented this at MESA, and they said, let's make this an industry standard, and here we are now in, it's now 2021. We've been adding languages all the way through. We've been presenting at various conferences. We now have a partnership. SMPTE is also helping to sponsor the LMT. You know, nothing's finalized at this point, but the intent is that LMT would be the standard for LMT, for SMPTE, for where languages are called for. We're up to version 3.03, and we have 239 languages with about another 150 on the way. So what we end up needing, or what the reason why we need it, is to have a unified source of reference for the language codes anywhere for the media and entertainment industries. But the reality is it works for lots of other organizations as well, including publishing, manufacturing, web design, etc. People need to know what language should be displayed, or what, and or you know, for the audio, etc. Here's a quick list of some of the working group members and the contributors. So those logos should look familiar to many of you. Why do we need an industry standard? Is because the LMT makes a distinction between the spoken and written languages. We end up having consistent codes now, so that is good when you have for your service providers, for your clients, for the studios or the content owners. So this gets back to where, you know, you're asking about Netflix. So if Netflix uses the same language code for its, you know, uses the LMT for its content. I mean, WarnerMedia has already adopted it. Disney's has adopted it. Viacom CBS has adopted it. And there's quite a few others as well that we're working with, you know, to help them with their adoption. That means that when you see a particular code, you see ES-419, you know you're getting Spanish as spoken in Latin America. All the ambiguity is taken away. So for our scope, it's really only languages. We include the code for audio, a code for the notation of the script or the writing system. So that's really your text, what you see on your screen. And we also have the endonyms in there. So it would be Français as well as French, for example. And these are the different use cases that we know that the LMT is appropriate for. So as I just said, the audio, the visual. So there's lots of visual in our world in media and entertainment. So you got your subtitles, closed captions. They're also burned in enforced narratives. And also, because this is really important, is accessibility. It's also useful depending on what you want to do with content licensing as well as rights. So if you want to just say it's good for Spanish, fine. But if you want to say, you know, I'm releasing this in, say, Brazil, but then there you have Brazilian, you know, Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, etc. So people, you know, not everybody knows that Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, but I do. Anyway, for distribution, there may be, you know, when we all go looking at something, we often have a choice of what language do we want to display or hear or both on our screen. So that's important. And more, our world is becoming smaller with localization. So right now, as I said, we have 239 languages with about another 150 coming, including languages of the Indian subcontinent. We're working with on a subcommittee for Chinese dialects and also Arabic. So here's what it looks like. The Internet Engineering Task Force, and it's a standard of standards. I hate to reinvent the wheel. Something is good out there, let's make it work for us, because again, then another company who I'm working with, another organization, if I have to distribute metadata out or send it out to that organization, and if we say everybody's using the Movie Lab spec, if everybody's using the language metadata table, then you know what's allowed in your fields, and it makes life a lot easier. Now, why do we need, so IETF BCP 47 is a standard. Why do we need the language metadata table? Because there could be over 40,000 different possible combinations. And that's a lot for anybody to deal with. So how do I know which one of the 40,000 I'm using? I go to the table and I look it up. So what is that table? And it's also a W3C standard, IETF BCP 47. So here's an example of what LMT looks like. We have all of these different column heads over here. So we group languages together. So again, to facilitate, there's, you know, here's English, Spanish, Serbo-Croatian, and here's the examples of the endonyms, which becomes very important. Here's a sample of the code. So here's Spanish is spoken in Latin America, and here's what it is in English, et cetera, et cetera. So it has what people need. And if you don't have to keep on inventing this in your organization, it saves a lot of time and money. And if you know what to expect, it saves time and money. So here we are, we have a working group. We actually have a meeting coming up next week. We're working on these additional 150 languages. We've been slogging through, working very hard to see what all the requests are. WarnerMedia, Viacom, CBS, and Disney and Sony are, I should add Sony on here, have made requests. If anybody else has additional languages that they need, please let us know. And you have the rest of the information on this slide. And we do have approvals. We do have an approval process. If you think about what I said earlier with regards to governance, that is one of the purposes of this working group, is to say, yep, this is going to work for my organization, therefore I approve it, and so we can move forward. So it's not just Meg and, you know, me sitting in our little ivory tower, of which we really don't have one, and saying, yep, I like this code. We want to hear from the people hands-on who have to use it and take it from there. So why do we even have LMT in the first place? Because MESA said, let's turn this into a standard, and they have been really incredible in supporting the LMT, and they help and doing what's needed. SMPTE has also just been fantastic. We've been working with folks on the SMPTE side, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. You guys already know who SMPTE is, so I don't have to explain that. So MESA, the way our roles are defined is MESA, where we work on the adoption guidelines, the templates, the resources, and everything else, whereas on the SMPTE side, it's more technical. So We're working on a validation tool, and also the SMPTE has the infrastructure for distributing standards, and you already have a standards process. And other folks that we've been working with include IDER, Movie Labs, and we have had also interaction with the ISDCF because they also wanted to update their language codes. So where are we today with SMPTE? It's in the technical committee number 30, and that they're working on the definition and implementation of the SMPTE registration authority. And also they want to make sure that's what that technical committee scope is. And right now, the LMT currently is in the project approval stage. We've been working with Bruce Devlin, who some of you may know, and some other folks from SMPTE, Thomas Baus Mason, and a few others who work on all these different things. And we do have the validator is available for preview. So, and again, this will become available to you. So there's the links if you've got questions. You can, there's the email address and all the LMT message. If you go to LMT at Mesa Online, that comes to both Meg and me. And it also, I believe, goes to somebody else from Mesa. There's a link there for the current 239 languages, and then there's a link to the demo. I also included in here a link to the some of the primary LMT code validation sources, as well as others. I will also say that we have, I presented at the European Union's Data and Semantic Conference in March, and there's been some interesting outcomes there, and there's some other organizations that also have put together their own IETF BCP 47 compliant lists. And we're checking against those. And so far we have, I think, 100% match against what this other organization has done. So we'll end up, I think, bringing them into the fold as well. And that's it for this presentation. And again, like the other one, there's an appendix with some other information where if you really want to look at the structure of the LMT, it will be available to you. So I look forward now to the Q&A, if there are any.
Yeah, that was my next go-to, is the Q&A. Thank you so much, Yonah. So I guess that that we could sort of maybe look towards another session, maybe in the fall, on governance.
That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I think that would be a good topic for a future session.
Sure.
Okay,
So-
we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but they're not really tied to your presentation, Yonah. The most recent one. It's up to the panel. Do you folks want to go into your discussion, or would you like to address these questions?
Well, I think I can probably kick off part of the discussion by addressing in a broad way at least two of the three that I'm seeing here.
Great.
So when it comes to critical metadata, and excuse me for a second, I have a frog in my throat. Is there any specific guidance on critical metadata to enter into something like a camera original, meaning as the image is captured? I would actually expand that and say beyond the camera original, when it comes to what goes into the camera, at the very least, the parameters of that camera, and hopefully your camera is intelligent enough to record its own make and model and serial number and any software versions that may be running on that camera, so that anybody in the future who might want to know how the image was created has some prayer of knowing how the image is created. And then especially one of the more important things as camera originals, or whatever your term camera original actually means, things like the bearing pattern on the chip that's actually in the camera, or at least the bearing pattern that was used at the time it was originally converted. And then if there was a better Bayer pattern that came out later for that camera, keep records of what those Bayer patterns were, because that would allow folks who wanted to go back after the fact, maybe sometimes years or decades later, to go back and make a better quality copy or do something different with that. And that goes to pretty much anywhere in the primary production sphere. So for your audio, you know, key data about how your audio was captured, both the original, not camera original, let's say microphone original, however the originals were created, whether they were captured from actual audio or they were generated electronically. What generated them, what were the parameters, what was the software and the revisions and stuff like that that created either those originals or those mixes as you start moving through the mixing process. And especially when it comes to things like languages, one thing we're going to notice as things like the language metadata table and other plethora of languages that are out there start being accommodated on a more wide basis, is also making sure that all of the elements that have language specific content in them, whether they be audio tracks or open or closed caption tracks or titling tracks or sprites on the side of a car that may all be language related, all also have the metadata tags for the language involved, because somebody who, you know, a great example is the movie Cars from Disney, where they had all these sprites that were logos that were on the sides of the cars. Well, you might, in some cases, like speaking of cultural differences, you might want to have those sprites be different in the Middle East than you would in North America or in Europe or in China. And so when it comes to the plethora of data, and we're starting to see the types of data that are being generated for productions really fracture into all these different feeders that go into how a production is done. That's where things like the language metadata table and metadata tagging in general are becoming more important. Not only how were they produced, when were they produced, and by what were they produced, not just the people, but the software and the hardware, because that may have some relevance to how you remix something or reauthor something in the future. And then for those of us who do content archiving, especially long-term data archiving, all of that metadata needs to be accommodated and needs to find homes. And so part of the standards work that is both going on now beyond what the metadata table folks are doing, but also those of us in the archive sphere. And a portion of this work is being done in another SMPTE committee called the AXF, the Archive Exchange Format Committee. At least a start on how do you make sure that all of the metadata that is generated, whether it be standardized or it be user specific or technology specific, has a way to be preserved so that when things need to be repurposed in the future, whether it's for remonetization or re-release or changes need to be done because cultural sensitivities have changed, that the maximum amount of information that has been captured from the beginning of a production or from the point in each production step where the metadata could be generated, that it gets captured at that point and it gets retained throughout the production, distribution, and long-term retention steps. Because in the end, what we're really talking about is after the first generation production and distribution, there's then a line that goes like this and goes back to a new workflow, which starts that all over again just 5 or 10 years down the road. And the question is, what has changed in those 5 years where you have to reauthor certain aspects of it? So over time, for any organization, commercial or non-commercial, that wants to reuse content over time, you're going to have a bunch of these circle backs that says, and this new process starts, and a lot of it is the same as before, but a lot of it is different.
All righty. And was there another question, or did you?
Well, I was debating how to do the 2 scenarios, but that starts getting into specific names, and I'm not sure
Okay.
I quite want to go down that. You know, there are examples out there of organizations. There is no organization today of any size that has done metadata perfectly, whatever that actually means, because we're all building the car as the car is rolling down the road. And that's the real challenge. Those of us who are dealing with SMPTE, a lot of the SMPTE standards work exists because a problem that has already been identified needs to be solved. And that goes for metadata as well as any kind of technical issues. And so what we have to do is we have to not only identify the problems that need to be solved, but identify how they were solved by other people before in different ways and be able to retain that data, but also harmonize data as, from the points where things are standardized, harmonize them. So not only potentially we have the original way that people did it back in the olden days, whatever that actually means, and then once things were standardized, here's where we harmonize the standards with the data that came before to make sure that future generations don't have to spend all the time and money reauthoring that all of us who have collections of any size are having to do right now.
I think it's worth noting that it's cheap to capture metadata up front as you move along, and rather than adding it later. So that's where I'm trying to make sure that people think about who the different audiences are for the metadata, because you may think, well, they're just going to need this once in post, but the reality is that archivists are going to need it. It's going to be remastered. It's going to be remixed. And again, someplace along the line, there may be some deal memo that may also have to do, that's going to have something else. And I'm just going to touch base quickly. We have a question. It sounds like clean and accurate metadata is a great asset that keeps wheels turning and keeps track of things. Can you think of examples when capturing a new kind of metadata that result in a new revenue stream? And I would say, and I've been tossing this around, is there an eighth kind of metadata, which is analytics? So, which is different, because you don't need analytics to create your product, but you do need to know a different kind of aboutness. But in this day and age, it may be the aboutness of the consumer as well as the creator. And I love James' example of the different branding of the cars, and all the signs that are around the racetrack that, people want to know, and then they tie that into other kinds of advertising.
Well, if I could follow up with that a little bit, I was making notes while you folks were talking, and a couple of things really occurred to me when it came to some of the metadata both of you were talking about, and some of those are especially when it comes to metrics, they are things like historic usage, data collection and retention, which would include where were things used, what ratings did they get when they were first marketed. What parts of the world were certain versions marketed to? In other words, things that people, because we don't have the data today, we can't get that granular into what was successful and what wasn't in certain parts of the world, certain parts of nations, even certain distribution media where something may have been successful on broadcast and cable television, but it may not have worked well in streaming. The question is, why didn't it work well in streaming? Well, it could have been a technical issue. It could have been the platform it was on. There are any number of issues where if you have the data on how things were made and distributed before, and who paid for it and who didn't, then you can, the people in the future who need to make decisions about what to repurpose and how to repurpose, and do we give something that failed another chance, because there are plenty of examples. Star Trek is a great example, where the original series kind of sort of was successful, but it didn't really hit its stride until it went into syndication. And then that's where another type of metadata comes into it, where things like rights clearances, like music clearances, like if you watch certain Star Trek episodes today in syndication, either on streaming or on broadcast, you will hear potentially different music between what's on streaming and what's on broadcast, because the original contracts, which never imagined something like streaming, never imagined something like home video, had clearances for broadcast, but did not have clearances for other usages. And so knowing where your pitfalls are, knowing where you might have to reauthor things, and also knowing how to write your future contracts or go back and try and renegotiate with the owners of something that you didn't have rights for now. That's also where you can really start making more money potentially in the future is, avoiding your pitfalls, but also if you have the opportunity to go back and restore something to get the rights for something like the music from a certain episode of Star Trek, you at least know where your landmines are. You know where your challenges are. And right now, not a lot of that data exists. And so there's a number of things that I can think of, like regional rights restrictions on news footage, where, I used to work for Reuters, and we had, no access certain countries because the video was sensitive in that country or somebody else owned it in that country. And so when it comes to any type of footage that someone might resell or reuse, regional restrictions, regional licenses, what was licensed where. Same with, any kind of programs that are shared around the world, where certain parts of the world were you had distribution by one company or set of companies, and in another part of the world, like the BBC in the UK versus the BBC partners outside of the US or outside of the UK, who had the rights to what, and what do you have the rights to now that you've inherited that library?
Cool. Will, did you have some things you wanted to discuss during the panel session here?
Oh, I see we have some more questions, so we should keep rolling on the questions. Knock them out.
All right. And just wanted to let everybody know that Joe, actually, do you want to introduce James a little bit and also talk about
Sure.
Dave not visible?
Yes. This is now a postscript, but James, his name and his image is familiar to many of us in SMPTE, is an Emmy Award-winning digital media engineer for data and media archiving, preservation, production, and is a project management specialist. He serves as the Senior Systems Administrator for the Library of Congress, National Audio Visual Conservation Center on the Packard campus for audio visual conservation in Culpeper, Virginia. And his responsibilities include all audio, video, film preservation, and digitization technologies, long-term planning and implementation of data preservation technology services to the United States Congress. That gives you a little bit of background on why he's so knowledgeable.
No pressure.
Yeah. I think you live and breathe this stuff every day. James participates in SMPTE standards work in technical committees regularly, all the time actually, including AMWA, which is the Advanced Media Workshop Workflow Association, and the Academy of Motion Picture and Arts and Sciences. He lives and works in Central Virginia, between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. So thank you, James, for spending some time with us this evening.
Thanks, Joe.
And I might as well, while I'm at it, introduce Dave Satin. Dave Satin is been around for a long time, like many of us. We fall into that same category. And Dave has been at the forefront of production for cinema and digital cinema and post-production for many, many years. He's the owner of the digital cinema engineering company for the last 15 years. And he's an expert in digital cinema, HDR, and 4K workflows. And he is the self-professed second best ultimate operator in the world. When Dave, he'll have to share with us, because I'm curious, who is the first? And maybe since you wrote that, maybe you've aspired to be number one.
Actually, not so much. And I am constrained contractually to remain the second best operator, and I have to say that I'm okay with that. But I wanted to comment on Paul Dougherty's question in the Q&A, and really sort of kind of circle back on what happens on set, because I don't know how many people get to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning in the pouring rain trying to get those last two shots. Our recording devices, whether they're for picture or for sound, do a fairly adequate job of collecting and parsing basic metadata, as you discussed, camera model, serial number of the media used, software revision, etc. The problem with everything else that's collected is, and that information lives in the media, and as long as you follow industry best practices to handle that, you will have all that information quite invisibly and accurately placed into the pipeline and as you go forward. What happens after offline editorial, though, is that a great many things are thrown away in its in quest for expediency, and things are renamed because of really no good reason in the 21st century, but that's how we always did it, so we're going to continue to do it that way. And as long as somebody remembers to keep the sidecar files with the camera and audio essence, you've got all that stuff. And certainly it makes it, I could tell you that it makes it at least to that first production LTO. Now what happens after that is far above my pay grade, but the sense of it that I have is that quickly disappears. And no matter how useful it would be, I don't think anybody's going to pay right now for anybody to handle that in some kind of planned method.
Isn't it also true that the different cameras have different formats, so that's also a challenge?
Well, I'm going to say that I guess the real problem is there isn't any real. There's no standardized solution for collecting that metadata. So I could talk about a very high resolution camera that is produced by a company in Munich, and the files it makes are so large that the camera pan, tilt, and roll information is excluded from being written into the files because it's accurate enough to be used. The government feels it's too accurate to be shared with anybody else. So we know the camera does this, and it's something that'll be very useful in visual effects operations, but we're not allowed to collect it. They're not allowed to publish it or even collect it, which is sort of an anathema to me, but it's one of those wonderful things about our business.
I actually meant file structure, that not format. The file structure from different cameras.
Every tool that's
clean. So if when you're downloading, you get, from model, from camera manufacturer A and camera manufacturer B, they're going to be downloaded in different hierarchies, and as you said, maybe then there's metadata that's not included. So that it's challenging.
Always.
Story.
Always.
Well, and to your point, Dave, one of the things that we've realized being at the other end of the production pipeline is that if you are going to create and capture metadata, assuming the technology is there to allow you to do that, one of the things you have to do is you have to build it in as part of the budget of every production, because if you build it in at the beginning, the cost is actually relatively low. It's a low single digit percentage. And so building that into your budgets is easy at the beginning. If you don't do it at the beginning and you do need that data later on and you need to recreate that data, then you're going to pay human beings to recreate that data, and suddenly it becomes 10 or 20 or 30 or 50% of future productions because you have had to go back and recreate that data. And so for those of us who discuss how to create metadata automatically and get it through the system, a big focus of that, and we're by no means at an ideal point when it comes to both standards and implementations in places like cameras. But one of the ideal points is to create that metadata at the point of content creation and to capture it in the file, and then make sure that all subsequent parts of the production workflow don't strip that data out once it's in there. And that is, to a certain extent, a design issue, but it is also a file issue. It goes to all parts of the technical challenges, and so we need to make sure that camera manufacturers are on board, that the standards organizations that define things like IMF file standards accommodate things so there's always a place for this metadata. And then that, you know, things like editing systems and content systems and storage systems do no harm. They don't strip the metadata out once you put it into your player to be named later vendor editing system that likes to strip metadata just because apparently it does, or they've never paid attention to it before. And that's where when we get to a level of sophistication, and we're getting there, you know, I think we're going to see complete workflows in the next 5 years where things aren't going to get stripped. That's when people can make buying decisions about what technologies are they going to purchase. And one of the decision-making factors may be doesn't strip metadata.
Oh, laudable task, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're working towards. We're not there yet, but we're working towards it.
Hey, Josh Gordon, I took a stab at that question you asked about what happens when a SME, a subject matter expert, leaves your company. How hard is it to pick up the pieces? And Yonah's going to chime in here in a second with the permanent record text-based answer. First, a persistent, thank you.
Or it's a data set management where you made sure that you captured the data and that data survived the departure of an individual.
And that's where the governance should be distributed, but still, at least.
And it's data retention policy setting at the enterprise level.
Knowledge base, yeah. Gotta have a common point of view to say for the continuity program.
Right, but there's your, and people don't always get this, but right now I'm working on taxonomy governance, which is purely about the terminology.
Control vocabulary.
Taxonomy, ontologies, you name it. And then there's the data governance, which is the quality of the data that is populated in those fields. So so I'm not sure if the question is about the data itself versus the terminology, but both need to happen. And I am a big believer in why train one person when you can train two, when you can train five.
Yes.
I will also say, depending on what type of organization you're coming from, there may be other sources of the metadata. You know, could be IDER, could be, you know, IMDb, could be all kinds of other third-party folks out there.
Yeah, enrichments, yeah.
Then it gets back into how much are you willing to pay for your own data? And it gets me back to the story that I don't remember. MTV had to buy footage, I believe, from the Getty for when Michael Jackson passed away, because they did not have enough metadata to attach to the content in order to be able to search and discover it in their own databases.
They didn't know where it was.
And maybe that's just a hearsay story, but I'm pretty sure I've heard that.
Well, there's a great story about how the BBC, when Margaret Thatcher died, this is a technology implementation issue where they had just moved into the new broadcasting house where they had concentrated everything from the BBC all in this new broadcasting house in London. You know, Television Centre had been moved. And so they didn't include a tape room at broadcasting house. And so they knew where the tape was, but they couldn't recover it and they couldn't get it to broadcasting house. And so they had to license other footage of Margaret Thatcher from a third party because their technology was not up to snuff. They knew that they had it. They knew where it was, but they had not, the people who did their technology planning did not make sure that they could access it on short notice. And that's another example.
It's like the final scene in the first Raiders of the Lost Ark where they walk into the archive and there's somewhere that giant warehouse.
I have a building over there where I can do that. I can walk a quarter of a mile, and every time I push a cart down that aisle, I hear the Indiana Jones theme in my head. So I noticed there's one other thing in the Q&A, and this is something that I'd like to sort of address as well. I'm not sure it hits this point exactly, but one of the common questions that I get is metadata in files versus sidecar files. And my quick answer to that is or sidecar files or databases? And my quick answer is, depending on where you are in the process, whatever process you're in, it could be all three. You know, one of the sayings in the archive community is something called loxis. Lots of copies keeps stuff safe. And so when it comes to metadata, that applies as well, where sure, you have it in your file, in the file that's coming out of your camera, but if you have a process that can take the key metadata points out of the file and have a sidecar, then that means that you don't have to parse this multi-gigabyte camera file to get 20 kilobytes worth of text, and you can use it. And so you can have that sidecar file. It's still in the main file, but it's also part of a sidecar. And then to extend it even further, if then you needed some or all of that data to then be searchable in a database, whatever database it may be. It may be, you know, an archive database. It may be a news database. It may be, you know, a copyright or licensing database. But then you also make sure that the key data points that you need in that database also automatically propagate into those databases as things move through the system. But your original copy is still in the camera original. It's hopefully your sidecar file is still there when you need it. It's still in the sidecar file, and the key data points that need to be in the database have also been populated to the database. And that is data planning and management, making sure that there are pipelines to get this stuff through the system and that it does so automatically, so humans don't have to do it manually, because one of the things humans are really bad at doing manually is doing it the same way every single time.
Good point.
So just a quick question, sort of tongue in cheek. So are we really talking about metadata right now? Is that really where where this discussion has gone?
Well, when I get to the point of, you know, talking to our deep archive folks, the answer is absolutely yes, because the same data that you need for your primary content and all of the associated essences that go along with it, whether it's a copy of the Word document that is your script, or it's the sidecar file of the XML that's inside of the camera file. When you get to the data retention and long-term policy setting, then you also have to have data about the data. In other words, when was this stuff last accessed? When did you last regenerate your checksum to make sure that the files that are in your archive have not changed? There's no data corruption going on. When was the last time you pulled a given asset back from Glacier because you have a copy of it in Glacier? How many times has it been accessed? How many people? Who were they and when? And so there's plenty of data about the data that's more than just metadata. There's metadata about the metadata that also, if you are going to take this to its logical conclusion and you have to keep things extant for, you know, decades or centuries. And in my case, in my division of the library, our measuring stick is the minimum copyright registration period, which right now is 150 years. You know, we have to keep things accessible, searchable, and usable under copyright law for 150 years from the day they arrive here. So that gives us a very different perspective on long-term planning, you know, for both physical media and for data retention. And it means also that, you know, very early on, we had to get zen with the whole concept of data migration on a regular basis. And what data do you need to not only get the data from an old system to a new system, but also to tell future generations, how many systems has this been on? How many times has this been checked? How many failures have you had? What types of failures were they? So if you see some anomaly in the future that managed to make it through our quality control, you at least have a prayer of knowing where that anomaly started. Because this really is, in certain ways, this is temporal engineering now, because we have to think about today what the people of the future will need who haven't even been trained yet. In some cases, in our case, with 150 years, some of them haven't been born yet and won't be born for decades to come. You know, what will those people need in the year 2200 to know what the hell we were doing today and why is this stuff here? I mean, big picture wise, the reason it's here is because copyright registration and for a couple of other reasons. But then, you know, why are certain things not here? How did things get lost over time? Was there a reason? You know, there have been nitrate fires over the decades. And so if you want to know why one reel of Gone with the Wind looks different than another reel of Gone with the Wind. Part of that is the metadata on the content, which is one was an original Technicolor print, whereas one was an Eastman color print, and we didn't have a Technicolor print for one of those reels because they were lost in a fire. But then future generations would need to know, well, why did these things look different? Was it the fact that the physical media was different, or was it the fact that the film scans were done at different times with different film scanners, that they were color corrected in different ways? How were they color corrected? And making sure that all of the data, you know, as a bundle that gets carried through these various data systems as we migrate every 5 to 10 years, migrate data sets every 5 to 10 years, knowing, you know, how those data sets were migrated. You know, if there's a corruption in a file that got missed in quality control, it's rare, but it does happen. Where did that start? When was the first time this corruption was noticed? So at least we know that, well, you know, yeah, that's been lost to history. Sorry, hopefully that doesn't happen very often. But part of the reason for having metadata about your data and about your metadata is to know what happened when, especially if you're talking about data sets that are being retained for decades or centuries. And I think just about anybody who's doing any kind of serious content creation today, any of the major organizations and many of the minor organizations, not just those of us who are government or cultural institutions, their data sets are essentially permanent as well. And so we share many of the same challenges, just for different reasons.
Very good. Did we lose Will?
I'm sure he's around. So.
Oh, he just turned his camera off. Okay, great.
Bio break.
Not to worry. Okay. There's two more questions. You want to handle those quick and then call it a night?
I had a short story, but we'd like to add as well.
Go ahead.
What James is saying. Well, so speaking of provenance and the long game of metadata, I've worked for a company where there's a phrase called the billing blocks. The billing blocks are like the credits as the original production company created them for a title, and you may receive a mezzanine file with a PDF of the billing blocks, because someone's going to potentially rewrite the synopses. They're going to add, or they're going to kind of clean up the metadata, and they're going to format it for their needs. But sometimes the PDF comes in with such minimal information that individuals are watching the credits of the film to make sure they've got it right, and then transcribing that. And of course, there are machine learning and AI programs that go and scan through and look for scene detection and recognition of actors and face recognition, things like that. That's a new generation of metadata being connected and captured. But there's also that sense of like saying, you know what, we received, because the film, the acquired content, was bought and sold multiple times. It had different windows over the years. A film from 1987, for instance, a B movie, might be bought and sold multiple times, and that people lost the billing blocks. We don't have the original press release or any of the billing block information. So they give you what the best available metadata, and then folks are then scouring through the credits and rolling stopping the tape, and then writing things down.
at how many dollars an hour? Exactly.
So, of course, IMDb, other sources do have both professional and crowd curated capture, but sometimes you want to make sure you get it from the source. You want to make sure you've got it right, and sometimes the end credits are the source version of the truth. That is the one you can't say it wasn't. There was no one, attributed something to someone else in a cloud database.
Unless they redid the credits at some point.
There's that too.
So one of my favorite examples is how many of us are old enough to remember the old Screen Gems logo on the end of television programs from the 50s, 60s, and 70s before it became Columbia Pictures Television. Right. A lot of us remember, the Dancing Sticks logo and the Hurricane logo. Well, go find one now. Go find credits with those on them. Go find credits that haven't been adjusted. And many of them haven't, but many of them have.
Yeah. Anyway,
for whatever reason.
That's my story. So, Joe?
So I'll
Yeah,
I'll
what
at
ab-
least
what
take a
about
stab
the,
at the how can you prevent entities from stripping metadata? The quick answer is demand that they stop, and also work with industry standard setting bodies, not just things like SMPTE or MESA, but also, you know, the folks who are working in the internet and the streaming environments, so that groups of organizations are setting standards so that Facebook and Instagram and the like are expected to come along for the ride. And one of those standards should be you don't strip metadata.
right. And a quick story about the metadata, is one that I was familiar with, where one company, whose name I will share, every day at the same time, they were noticing the same files were being downloaded over and over again, day after day. And, you know, after some investigation, only to find out that it was during a certain person's break time, and they would just keep repeatedly downloading that same file over and over again, so that they could go out and smoke a cigarette.
We take the last question from, who wants to take the last question?
Well, I'll take a stab at it.
Could Dave answer this? Or we haven't heard
Well,
much.
yeah. Dave, do you have something to say?
I always have a lot of things to say, but you want to talk about transport media. So far as I know, you might get the number of pixels in the frame rate out of a 2110 stream, but not much more than that. You know, this is some and ATSC 3.0. I know that's a broadcast standard that I don't think is. I don't know how many people are ever going to be watching broadcast TV again. So I mean, we certainly don't anymore. So I'm gonna say I don't know anything about that either. But you know, live video streams tend to have might have a few items from the camera in them in the horizontal or vertical ancillary data areas. You know, Hank and Vank, but so many things stick their noses into those streams that it's rare that I actually see any of that metadata come through, you know, from a simple camera to a transmitter to the letbox on my cart, for instance. You know, some cameras do it well, some cameras don't. There seems to be no rhyme or reason as to why one thing does work one day and not the next day. So I'm going to say there are no metadata practices that I know about IP video or broadcast video.
And I'll throw in a little bit extra. In 2110, there's no Hank and Vank, because the concepts that that existed in SDI the timings have been thrown away. However, there is ancillary data space included in 2110, and so part of, you know, what we as an industry need to figure out is, what do we want to put there, and would it change depending on which 2110 link you're on? If it's coming back from the stadium and it's a switched feed of a game instead of ISOs, you would probably want very different metadata in the 2110 feeds coming back from a stadium versus the ISOs coming back from the stadium. In the case of 3.0, just to speak to the first point you made, Dave, is, well, we're, according to, I think it's the NAB said that there were 18% of Americans now are back to broadcast television. And, you know, I think the rumors of broadcast television's death are way too early yet. And especially with 3.0 being a very different beast than 1.0 was, which is, it really has been developed for mobile handheld and much more robust reception. I think we're going to see uses for broadcast content and broadcast data that we're only just dreaming of right now. And so what metadata will be necessary will change over time. There's certainly metadata already in there, not just you know, basic metadata like closed captioning and what the frame rate is and stuff like that. But 3.0 does have the ability to also provide back channel metrics to broadcasters about who's using what and what, things like regionalized ads. If you have an ad that you're playing out over your station or over your ATSC 3.0, what appears on a mobile handheld handset as an ad or a sprite might be different than what somebody sees on the television at home, might be different from what someone sees coming over DirecTV, satellite or cable, all because they have now been able to focus the ads that are being played based on the distribution channel that particular content is going over. And so I think we're early days to really know exactly what will be in there other than the required metadata that's already there and the required spaces that are already there. How they will actually be used, we've got some good ideas that folks have talked about in other SMPTE programs and other 3.0 and 2110 programs. But since the spaces are there to accommodate that metadata, the chances for innovation are there. We'll see.
So I need to just jump in for a second, and maybe Joe's getting ready to do the same thing. One of the big things that 2110 does add to the picture is carrying information about color spaces and dynamic range and wide color gamut and things like that, which was pretty hard to do in the world of SDI. And with 2110, that's all part of the session description protocol for every stream. So we haven't thrown out everything. There's definitely some useful information, particularly for some of the new color spaces and dynamic range issues that we're going to be addressing, I think, more and more in the production and distribution chain going forward.
Actually, Wes, my question was slightly in a different direction regarding 2110 in reference to PCAP information, and if there's any work towards referencing that data that's captured for SLA reporting.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're spending a lot of time looking at metrics for video transmission channel performance. And in fact, there's a whole group within the 32NF folks that are working on standards for how do you test all these things and how do you measure them. And one of the things we're trying to do is normalize all the definitions of the measurements that you make of 2110 in order so that vendor A has a box that says, well, you got this performance, and vendor B has a box that says you got this performance for a particular spec, that you both get the same results. But that's probably something good to talk about.
Those captures are laid off somewhere on a thumb drive or a hard drive or a server somewhere, and they're laid off. Then they need to be able to be referenced so you can get back to that, that matching corresponding file that matches the video and audio flows, so you can compare them and for SLA reporting.
And also for diagnosing issues in your workflow, you want to look at those metrics at multiple steps through your live workflow, and by doing that, you can definitely isolate a problem. But I think that's probably another good topic for a meeting here at SMPTE New York sometime in the future.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, test and measurement in the 2110 world.
So Yonah, you wanted to give a pitch for the Rutgers Dam Certificate Program?
Sure. One of the things that we had talked about with regards to this meeting also is that, COVID certainly has been a crazy time for a lot of folks. And one of the things that I know is that SMPTE has a huge number of educational programs. There's different kinds of courses and stuff that people can take. And I think that depending, although things seem to be coming back to life now, which is really good, but certainly to encourage, online education opportunities such as this seminar, as well as SMPTE's formal courses. But I also wanted to give a quick pitch to the Records Stamp Certificate Program, Digital Asset Management. I'm the co-founder and co-director. There's 6 basic courses. It's kind of like, what is digital asset management, metadata, creative workflows, governance, how do you keep it green and stuff like that. And we have some other courses also on museums, DAM for GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, museums. That was a new one for me. Rights, we have a special course on that. We're also doing some other technical considerations. The reason why I think it's also could be interesting to some of the SMPTE membership is if you replace that D for DAM with M for MAM with media asset management, it's really a lot of the same kind of problems that need to be solved and different ways to think about things. So I'll just put put this into the chat, I guess, to everybody. I'll put the link in there if people are interested. So just trying to help everybody help themselves. I don't get any commission for it, although I do get paid just, gobs of money from Rutgers for.
Oh, of course. Yes.
It's the way you're getting rich, right?
Yeah, college faculty are always notoriously overpaid. Yes.
Academics. 1% of academics.
So, so that there's some cool stuff out there, and I just want to help everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll look for that in the chat and try to put that in the comments area for the description of the video when we get it posted.
Yep, and it just I pasted it in the wrong place.
Well, Joe, Will, you guys are in charge.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, Will, anything on your end that you still have you want to share?
I'm good. If anyone has questions for me about what they saw today and wants to learn more about how I have solved some of these problems, you can reach me on LinkedIn, reach me online. You can find me and we can chat. And I want to say, James and Dave and Yonah, thank you so much for coming here today to talk about these topic and also to bring your years of experience and wealth of knowledge to the attendees to the session.
My pleasure, and it's been great. And if you have language metadata table questions, you can go to Mesa Online, look under communities, and I will get those decks out to Joe after this meeting.
And I look forward to whatever conversations this gets started. Meetings like this tend to be seed planting. It'll be interesting to see what trees grow out of this.
Dave, anything from you?
Other than the fact that I thought this was way more interesting than my expectations. It's funny that
you have very high expectations.
Well, I'm going to say that I tend to get buried in the front end of these things, and while I'm aware of what happens after we hand off those files,
right.
It's interesting to know that somebody's actually thinking about this stuff, because on my end, if it costs one more penny, the answer is no.
Yeah. About the supply chain.
Okay, well, with that, I just want to thank everyone for your participation. Yonah, James, Will, David, Wes, for your help, and for everyone that helped to bring this forward. Thank you for your time, your expertise, your knowledge, sharing it with SMPTE. And really, on behalf of SMPTE especially, thank you for all your contributions and the time that you've spent. So with that, we'll say have a great evening.
Thank you, Joe, Josh, Wes, James.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.